You've probably done it 1,000 times. You wake up on a random Tuesday with this surge of energy out of nowhere. Today's the day. Today you're finally going to start that thing you've been putting off for weeks. You can feel it. The motivation is real this time. You make plans, you write lists, you can actually see yourself doing it. And for a few hours, maybe even a whole day, you're on fire. You're moving. You're productive. You feel like a completely different person. Then, just as suddenly as it arrived, it's gone. The next morning, you can barely get out of bed. The idea of doing anything feels impossible. And you're left sitting there wondering what happened, why you can't just keep that feeling going, why motivation works for everyone else but never sticks for you. Here's what nobody tells you. It's not because you're lazy. It's not because you lack discipline. And it's definitely not because you're broken. What you're experiencing is not a motivation problem. It's a brain chemistry problem. And once you understand what's actually happening inside your head, everything starts to make sense. Most people operate on a system where effort leads to reward, and that cycle keeps them going. They do something hard, they feel accomplished, that feeling fuels the next task, and it builds momentum naturally. But if you have ADHD or you're neurodivergent in certain ways, your brain doesn't run on that system. Your brain runs on interest, novelty, urgency, and in some cases, pure emotional intensity. Without one of those elements present, the engine doesn't start. It doesn't matter how important the task is. It doesn't matter how much you want to do it. If the brain doesn't register it as stimulating enough, you're stuck. And here's where it gets tricky, because sometimes, randomly, your brain does light up. Something clicks. Maybe it's a new idea, maybe it's a looming deadline, maybe it's just the right song playing in the background at the right moment. Suddenly you have access to all this energy you didn't have 5 minutes ago. So you run with it. You push yourself as hard as you can because you know this window won't last. You stay up late. You skip meals. You ignore everything else because this is your chance to finally get something done. And it works. For a little while, it actually works. But then the crash comes. And it's not just tiredness. It's complete shutdown. Your brain feels like it's moving through mud. Everything that felt easy yesterday now feels insurmountable. And the worst part is the guilt. Because you know you were capable of doing it before. You've seen yourself do it. So why can't you just do it again? Why does it feel like you're constantly fighting against yourself? If this sounds familiar, go ahead and subscribe to the channel and hit the like button, because we're going to keep unpacking exactly how this works and what you can actually do about it. The thing is, when you rely on those bursts of energy, you're not actually building sustainable momentum. You're borrowing energy from your future self, and your brain keeps a ledger. Every time you push through exhaustion, every time you force yourself to focus when your brain is screaming for a break, you're creating a deficit. And that deficit has to be paid back eventually. That's the crash. That's the day when you can't get anything done no matter how hard you try. Your brain is recovering from the overdraft. Now, people without ADHD don't usually experience this the same way because their brains regulate dopamine and norepinephrine more consistently. They get a steady drip of those chemicals throughout the day just from doing normal tasks. Finishing something feels good. Checking something off a list feels rewarding. That reward keeps them moving forward. But if your brain doesn't produce enough dopamine naturally, or if it burns through it too quickly, you don't get that steady drip. You only get the flood when something is new, exciting, high stakes, or emotionally charged. Everything else barely registers. So you end up living in this cycle, waiting for the next wave of motivation, riding it as hard as you can, crashing, feeling guilty, waiting again. And every time it happens, you internalize the message that you're unreliable, that you can't be trusted to follow through, that something is fundamentally wrong with you. But nothing is wrong with you. You're just operating with a completely different operating system, and nobody gave you the manual. Here's an example that might hit home. Let's say you need to organize your closet. It's been a mess for months. You know it needs to get done. You've thought about it 100 times. But every time you walk past it, your brain just says no. Not today. It doesn't feel urgent. It doesn't feel interesting. There's no emotional charge to it. So it sits there, and you feel bad about it, but you still can't make yourself do it. Then one day, a friend texts and says they're coming over tomorrow. Suddenly, the urgency is real. The deadline is real. And in 2 hours, you've completely transformed that closet. You didn't become more disciplined overnight. You didn't suddenly find willpower. Your brain just finally had a reason to release the chemicals you needed to get started. That's why so many people with ADHD are incredible in a crisis. When everything is on fire, the brain works perfectly. There's urgency, there's novelty, there's intensity. All the right ingredients are there. But when life is calm and stable and you're supposed to just do regular maintenance tasks, that's when it falls apart. Because the brain isn't wired to care about things that don't feel immediately important. And this is where the misunderstanding happens. People see you crush it under pressure and assume you're just lazy the rest of the time. They see you obsess over a new project for 3 days straight and assume you could do that whenever you wanted if you just tried harder. But they don't see the aftermath. They don't see the days where you're completely drained and can't even respond to a text message. They don't see the internal battle of wanting so desperately to do something and being physically unable to make your body move toward it. One of the most painful parts of this experience is the gap between intention and action. You can want something so badly. You can plan it out in detail. You can see yourself doing it. But when it's time to actually start, there's this invisible wall. And no amount of logic or self-talk or motivational videos can break through it. Because it's not a mindset issue. It's a neurochemical issue. Your brain is waiting for the signal that says this task is worth the energy. And if that signal doesn't come, you're stuck. So what happens over time is you start to distrust yourself. You stop making plans because you don't believe you'll follow through. You stop telling people what you're working on because you're afraid you'll disappoint them. You stop setting goals because the gap between what you want to do and what you actually do feels too painful. And that's when the real damage happens. Not from the ADHD itself, but from the shame and self-doubt that builds up around it. But here's the shift that changes everything. Once you understand that this isn't a character flaw, once you realize that your brain is just running on a different fuel system, you can stop fighting against yourself and start working with how you're actually wired. You can stop waiting for motivation to show up and start creating the conditions that make action possible. That doesn't mean tricking yourself or forcing it. It means understanding that your brain needs certain ingredients to function, and you can actually provide some of those ingredients intentionally. Novelty, for example. If a task feels boring, you can change the environment. Work in a different room. Play different music. Use a different notebook. It sounds small, but novelty is one of the things your brain responds to. It's not about the task being fun. It's about it being different enough that your brain pays attention. Urgency is another one. And you don't have to wait for a real deadline. You can create artificial urgency by setting a timer, telling someone you'll send them something by a certain time, or even just deciding that you're only going to work on it for 10 minutes. The time limit creates just enough pressure that your brain registers it as worth engaging with. The other thing that makes a massive difference is understanding rest. Real rest. Not scrolling on your phone for 3 hours because you're too tired to do anything else, but too guilty to actually relax. That's not rest. That's limbo. Rest is when you give your brain permission to fully disengage, knowing that you're not being lazy, you're recovering. Because if you're constantly in overdraft mode, constantly pushing through crashes, you're never going to build any kind of sustainable rhythm. You'll just keep cycling between extremes. And the hardest part to accept is that some days, even when you do everything right, it still won't work. Some days your brain just doesn't have it. And that's not failure. That's biology. The more you can separate your worth from your productivity, the easier it gets to navigate the hard days without spiraling. There's something deeply unfair about living in a world that's built for neurotypical brains when yours works completely differently. You're expected to have consistent energy, steady focus, and reliable motivation. And when you don't, you're told to try harder. But trying harder doesn't fix a dopamine regulation issue. It just makes you more exhausted. What actually helps is understanding the system you're working with and stopping the fight against it. You're not failing because you're weak. You're struggling because you're trying to run software that your hardware wasn't designed for. And once you stop blaming yourself for that, once you stop internalizing every crash as proof that you're not good enough, you create space to actually figure out what does work. Not what works for other people, what works for you. Because the truth is, you've been working so much harder than anyone realizes just to do the basic things that come easily to others. And that effort, that constant invisible effort, deserves to be acknowledged. Not dismissed, not minimized, not compared to someone else's highlight reel. Motivation isn't the answer. It never was. Motivation is just a spark, and sparks are unpredictable. What you need is something more sustainable than that. You need systems that work even when you don't feel like it. You need environments that reduce friction instead of adding to it. You need to trust that your brain isn't broken. It's just different, and different doesn't mean less. So the next time you're sitting there wondering why you can't just make yourself do the thing, remember this. It's not about wanting it enough. It's not about trying harder. It's about recognizing that your brain needs specific conditions to function, and those conditions aren't always within your control. But some of them are. And that's where the real work begins. Not in forcing yourself to be someone you're not, but in building a life that actually fits the brain you have.